Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. My other podcast, Origin Story, is back this week for Season 5. On today's show, Parliament voted this week on whether MPs arrested over sexual assault should be excluded from the Westminster estate straight away before they are charged. Is this the start of restoring integrity to British politics? Plus, Health Minister Maria Caulfield is facing calls to refer herself to the Ethics Committee for promoting the 15-minute cities conspiracy theory. We'll discuss the reality versus the paranoid fantasy. And in the extra bit for supporters, Apple released a new iPad advert, and it's safe to say the reaction has been crushing. How did the relationship between art and tech go sour? Before we start, a couple of quick messages. American Friction, our new US politics podcast, is out now. Jacob Jarvis, Chris Jones, and Rolling Stone politics reporter Nikki McCann Ramirez speak to leading experts from across the US to tell you what you need to know before November's election. That's available right now, wherever you get your podcasts. And on Oh God, What Now, we are very much looking forward to our sold-out live show in London on Monday evening. If you can't make it and you're a Patreon supporter, we'll be streaming it live on Zoom, and you can register now on Patreon. Rest assured, there won't be any Wi-Fi problems like there were at the last Origin Story live show. Very sorry, it's a different venue, it's all hardwired, we are plugged into the mainframe. Let's meet today's panel. First, it's journalist and author Marie Leconte. Hello, Marie.
Hello.
The government has, well, not yet published, but it's been reported that there are new guidelines about sex education in schools, and they seem to be as well thought out as you might expect. Can you just explain what they are?
Yes, so the government is apparently about to shake things up, and so the new guidelines involve things like school must not teach children about gender identity at all. There cannot be any explicit conversations about sex until children are 13, including contraception, STIs and abortion. There shouldn't be any sex education whatsoever for children until the age of 9. But also, weirdly, children aged 11 should be taught about sexual harassment, revenge porn, grooming, stalking and forced marriage.
It's a wild ride.
So
there's nothing and suddenly it's like grooming.
But also, I think I don't really understand how you can be taught at 11 about revenge porn, but about sex at 13. Like that's a weird, like, yeah, and obviously, and kids, remember, you cannot film stuff.
We'll tell you about that later.
Yeah. But just don't film it in the meantime. But no, I mean, I find it enraging as a thing. For a number of reasons. Partly, I think the kind of gender identity stuff feels a bit Section 28-ish.
Well, it uses the dog whistle gender ideology,
yes,
which really does give the game away.
Yeah. But also, I think more broadly, I don't know, what I find unbelievably frustrating is that we live in a world where the internet exists. So I think this idea that kids are not being confronted with all this stuff already by just existing online is mad to me.
Well, a couple of things occurred to me. One is that actually kids are not being taught about sex per se before 9. Like the head teachers are going, well, this isn't an issue. All the studies show that if you don't inform kids early, that puts kids in more danger. And I also feel like with the gender ID stuff, it's sort of the point of the spear for this kind of more reactionary, won't somebody think of the children
thing, absolutely.
Which is why it's been framed around that. But it's generally just seems to be a backward step.
And also, I think, again, what is very frustrating is that I think that a lot of people warned that would happen. Like, for the past few years, a lot of people have been saying the trans stuff is only the first step. And it was always going to, be the first step. So I think, what's happening at the moment was entirely predictable. And I feel like a number of studies over the years have shown that actually, if you want kids to not get sexually abused, or at least understand what's going on, be able to talk about it to other adults, etc., be able to report it, they need to know what's going on. And again, that's not, fucking that woke theory or anything that's been proved time and time again. So I think it's also we're putting children at risk of being abused and not having the language to deal with it in any way, which is horrific. So no, it is just, it is infuriating. And also I think, and I think you could probably say that about many other things at the moment, but everything is crumbling in Britain. Is that really the one thing we're going to spend government kind of, time and energy on?
Not just that, lanyards also.
Oh, yeah, let's not even get into the lanyards.
But with a bit of luck, I mean, the guidelines, like earlier guidelines that were floated in this sort of area, just may not come into play because there might be a different government very soon. So, who knows? We have the new Westminster editor of The Lead, Zoe Grünewald. Hello, Zoe.
Hello.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Sharon Graham of Unite seems very happy with Labour's New Deal for working people, just days after threatening to withhold union funds from the election campaign if the party rode back on protections to appease business interests. How did they turn this around so quickly?
Labour and the unions basically sat down in a room with the door shut and hashed it out, I think.
Beer and sandwiches,
basically,
old school.
yes. Yeah. So we know that there was lots of sort of briefing and counter-briefing about Labour's New Deal for Workers, which included all sorts of things. But the main gist is it's including the package of employment rights that workers get in this country. So it's stuff like ban on 0 hours contracts, the right to switch off, bringing certain legal protections and statuses in line, clamping down on sexual harassment and the use of NDAs, all these things that were supposed to make life better for workers. And it's become a key cornerstone of Labour's offering to the unions. And we know that in the background of this, Labour's been courting business on a massive scale. So trying to deal with this tension has been really important for the Labour Party. And that's why their New Deal for Workers has been so big. So it kind of annoyed everyone when just a couple of weeks ago, there was all this talk in the press that Labour were going to U-turn on it. And obviously this goes in the context of a narrative that Labour keeps U-turning on all their policies. Reading the briefings, none of it to me was ever that convincing because it spoke about the fact that Labour was saying they would need to consult with business before they implemented any of these things. Now, I would say that's actually quite sensible. You do need to have discussions with business about how these things might impact them. It doesn't necessarily mean that businesses would get the final veto. And I think that's what was being hashed out over the table the other day with the unions, which was that they needed assurances from Keir Starmer that this package of workers' rights was still going to go ahead. It was still going to be implemented. It might be consulted with business, but business wouldn't have the deciding say on whether or not it would go ahead. So that's kind of, that tension, I think, was just getting really, it was getting worse and worse because of all these briefings. But being able to sit down and talk about it.
But maybe there wasn't that much substance to it. There wasn't some big U-turn that was planned, do you think?
I don't think so. I think it sounds like there was a bit of briefing coming out of Labour about this, and the question as to why someone in Labour might want to brief out that there was going to be a rollback on their workers' rights package is an interesting one to get into, probably for someone who knows the Labour Party very, very well and all the tensions and factions there. But I think ultimately they would say their plans are the same. They've always had to consult with business. Yeah. I think that the thing that is worrying is just the fact that because it's been briefed out, does it mean that somebody in the Labour Party is getting a sense that there is a softening of the approach towards business? It's all very political, essentially. But for now, the unions seem happy. We know Sharon Graham is very kind of vocal about these things. So until we actually do see a full U-turn, I think people shouldn't be too worried about this.
Let's begin. On Monday night, the Commons voted to refer MPs arrested for violent or sexual offences to a special panel which can bar them from the Westminster estate even before they are charged. This is a physical exclusion. They would remain MPs with voting rights. The bill was developed by a cross-party commission, including Commons leader Penny Mordaunt and Shadow leader Lucy Powell. But Mordaunt tried to water it down so that exclusion only happened after the MP was charged with an offence. Powell said that this was long overdue. Is this a preview of Starmer's pledge to restore integrity to politics? So, firstly, the bill passed by just one vote, 170 to 169, and one of those votes was Natalie Elphicke, whose defection to Labour was clouded by her previous efforts to defend her husband, an MP accused of sexual offences. That's some good script writing, right?
Indeed. I mean, I think it seems to be an extraordinary stroke of luck for Keir Starmer. This was a row that actually went on for far longer than I think Labour would have liked it to. I think they thought there'd be a day of, we've accepted a really right-wing Tory into the party. It turned into almost a week of, do we really want someone who's espoused those kind of views about victims of sexual assault? But this just happened to tie in with this vote. And you couldn't have, as you say, you couldn't have written those numbers better, because people you can argue the deciding vote was Natalie Elphicke. I mean, it's almost like this character arc for her. It's like she's come full circle. And obviously it's not really, it's not really that simple. It was a very tight vote, and it wasn't like she was the last one to make her decision, and it was all very kind of poetic.
Because votes aren't like in movies where somebody basically is just sort of like they've got the flesh wound, and they're crawling over the line to the vote, and that's the final one.
Yeah. But
Should be like that, obviously.
Yeah, but I do think this has slightly softened all the kind of chatter around her, because she did vote in line with what Labour wanted, and now the legislation has passed, which is great. Lots of people are very happy. Of course, it was a cross-party, so it was a cross-party amendment to the motion. So the motion was on excluding MPs who had been charged with sexual offences. And the amendment took it back to its original proposal from the Standards Committee, which was arrested. So it was a much lower threshold.
So why did Mordaunt, who now looks rather foolish, considering that she was part of this, making this sort of bill happen, why did she dilute it?
Well, it's a good question. So there are sort of two arguments that have been put forward by MPs as to why they didn't like this proposal. The first was the idea that MPs have a right to represent their constituents, and their constituents have a right to be represented in Parliament. So if an MP has been arrested and is then made to stay away from the estate, that's not fair on their constituents. The other argument is that as MPs, they are more vulnerable to vexatious complaints. Which, we can get into all the reasons why that's a really problematic thing to say, not least the fact that there are so many allegations of misconduct coming out of Westminster. There's no evidence that vexatious complaints about sexual assault are any more common than any other crime. We know that the charge and conviction rate for rapes in this country is appallingly low. So just for Parliament to sort of put forward and peddle these myths is actually, I think, very, very disappointing for a lot of people to see. But the other thing is the political element, which is that Penny Mordaunt is the leader of the House, so she was responsible for putting down this motion. She's also got quite obvious leadership ambitions. A lot of the opposition to this motion was coming from the Tory right and some of those really vocal backbenchers. There is definitely an argument to say that it wouldn't have benefited a potential leadership campaign for Penny Mordaunt for her to spearhead this vote. So I think
you need the creeps on side.
Unfortunately, you need the creeps on side.
I mean, it does look great for a woman to be throwing women under the bus to appease the Tory right for her own career. I mean, that's a lovely little narrative she's written for herself there.
Well, indeed. And I think, as you say, now she looks rather foolish. And there was all sorts of mess around the vote itself. There weren't enough MPs there. I mean, Sam Coates from Sky put out loads of text messages. You could see all the chaos that was unfurling. I mean, it's just made the Conservatives look disorganised, and it's made them look bad, because why are they trying to make it easier for MPs who have been arrested for sexual misconduct to be in Parliament?
Well, maths-loving listeners will notice that if you add up 170 and 169, you are some way short of the full House. So there was a numbers issue. Marie, like Zoe, you spend a lot of time talking to MPs, and it can't all be anonymous briefings. You must get a sense of what it's like as a workplace. How does it compare? What kind of complaints do they have?
So I think, I don't know, we could spend the rest of the podcast on that question, but I think one of the big problems is that it's not really a workplace, and that it's actually 650 small workplaces, because every single staffer, because, quite often the victims of sexual assault and abuse and rape, etc., are parliamentary staffers, because they're younger, because they have less power, etc. So yeah, for a start, they're not employed by Parliament or by the party; they're employed by their MP. So think of it as 650 small businesses that happen to share a building. As a result, there's no HR, there's no one really to go to. And I think if you talk to a lot of people who've gone through the processes formally and informally, they will say that the whip's offices, to be blunt, are not always the most helpful. That it depends on who you are and what your complaint is and who the complaint is against, etc. So then, the first thing is this kind of informal system where again, there's no kind of overarching structures. The second one, I think, and I don't believe has kind of been written about enough, is that stuff kind of can get swept under the carpet quite easily. So, everyone, if you speak to everyone in Westminster, they'll talk big on that. And of course we care and, really want to stamp out harassment and abuse in Westminster, etc. But then there's always going to be MPs who everyone knows are creeps, are abusers, etc. And I think the third thing, which is quite obvious, but it's also like it's a very party political place. So I think a lot of people's impulses will be to probably cover their own or try and land other people, in it if it's convenient for them, etc. So I think, but by definition, stuff is always going to get quite mangled and be used in a very cynical way.
As we've seen with the Natalie Elphicke case, cover for your own until they're not your own anymore, and then go, you won't believe what she's done. And the main objection to the bill is that everyone is innocent until proven guilty. True. But Lib Dem MP Wendy Chamberlain responded, it's not about the guilt or innocence of any individual MP, but about safeguarding. So do you think that barring accused MPs from the estate without yet expelling them from the Commons sort of walks that line?
I do think it strikes the right balance, yes. And also, so I did a piece a couple of months ago on threats to women who work in Westminster, so MPs and staffers, etc. And it was very much meant to be about constituents and people sending horrible messages and stuff. But then I did speak to a staffer who made the point of saying, well, I mean, sure, we get all that, but also, let's be frank here, we're also at threat against our own bosses and our bosses' friends. And it's like the calls are very much coming from inside the house. So no, absolutely, I think that's the right balance, and you do have to think of the victims. Because imagine knowing that some of those people have committed crimes, and everyone kind of tends to know, and just seeing them out and about, seeing them in the bars. That's not what we feel, especially like a young woman or a young man. That doesn't feel great.
It's also worth pointing out that there are. I mean, I know of a number of staffers, also House of Commons staff who are sort of, they don't work for MPs, but they work for the House of Commons, who have been victims to incidents of sexual misconduct and who absolutely would never report it because they're like, what's the point? I'll still have to see this person walking around the estate. Either I'll be moved out of my job so I don't come across them. But if I'm just walking to one room, a conference room or whatever, I might come across this person. Whereas in any other business, if someone was accused of sexual misconduct, they would be suspended from their workplace immediately, pending an investigation. That's not even a police investigation. It's most people would be told you need to stay away while this is going ahead.
Right. So there is an innocence of being guilty to an extent, like as in not immediately fired, but you get out of the office.
And there also needs to be a level of proof to be arrested. You're not just arrested because somebody says this person assaulted me. The police will have to conduct an initial investigation and they'll say, actually, there is enough evidence here to arrest you.
And quite often as well, and I'm sure you've spoken to people who've had similar stories as well, some people will try to report stuff to the police, but the police will be a bit like, and then not really do anything. So
nothing we can do.
We don't really have a problem with the police arresting too many alleged sexual offenders.
That's not no.
So Zoe, Starmer has a strong moral code in some respects. His critics rightly point out this did not prevent him from breaking all of his pledges in the leadership contest. But that does not mean that he doesn't have these kind of red lines and a sort of moral core. How do you perceive that? What are the things that he really will be resolute on?
Well, the one thing I really do think Starmer would be very resolute on, and you might laugh at this because it feels like, the bar is on the floor at this point, is that you really hope he wouldn't do anything illegal. And you might laugh, but it didn't stop Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak, who have both received fixed penalty notices. Starmer makes a real virtue of the fact that he is a lawyer. He was quite afraid of leaning into that for a while because of the sort of Jimmy Savile attack line that Boris Johnson kept trotting out, and this worry that it would maybe isolate him from the electorate who were a bit sceptical of these, lefty lawyer voices. But actually, he's done quite well recently of presenting himself as an advocate for victims, as an advocate for people who are wronged, and also as having a core of integrity and wanting to do the right thing. That's why I was a little bit disappointed by the Natalie Elphicke defection, because I felt like it undermined some of that image he'd created for himself, which I actually thought was really appealing to a lot of people. There's always going to be a proportion of voters who just don't trust anyone in Westminster. But I think Starmer actually did a lot at a time where people were really frustrated with politicians to say, I'm not like that. And you might have thought Starmer was a bit boring and a bit uninspiring. You didn't really know much about his policies, but you might have thought he was a safe pair of hands that wouldn't sort of do political wheeling and dealing that undermined those core principles.
What I wonder is that New Labour came in 1987, promised to bring an end to a period of Westminster scandals, which was, absolutely remarkable series of events there. Soon produced his own. mostly to do with money. And Blair did like being around people with money. Starmer, I don't know. I don't get that vibe from him. It is almost that sort of, boring quality. You don't imagine he's going to be sort of, dazzled by billionaires. Do you think he will want to be seen to be tougher on wrongdoing by Labour MPs and donors?
I think so. And I think that's because he's made integrity such a huge part of his offering. He speaks all the time about scandal and the sleaze of Tory years. And I mean, we're seeing it now play out with how the Tories are trying to go for Angela Rayner. I think he knows once you've made such a big deal out of that, you've got to stick to it, because otherwise they'll absolutely go for you. I think that will be. And I really do think that is a good selling point. Because as I say, yes, there are people who are really disenfranchised by Westminster, but I think people just think it's a swamp right now. And I think that's why, if he can do something to restore some of that trust and integrity, that could be really transformational.
Well, we should say there's an Integrity and Ethics Commission proposed on the slate. Marie, talking of the swamp, it was the Chris Pincher scandal, not Partygate, that finished off Boris Johnson. Some of these other scandals have obviously led to by-elections, humiliating defeats. 65% of respondents in an Ipsos poll said the government did not follow high ethical standards. 45% it got worse since the 2019 election. Yet only 8 Tories voted for the amendment, including Theresa May. Isn't it just in the self-interest of the Tory party to clean up its act?
You'd fucking think.
It's not helping.
I'm going to be entirely honest with you. I saw that question in the script, and my entire answer in my head was, you'd fucking think. And I could not come up with anything else. I wish I could say more. but it baffles me as well. Cards on the table. I've not really spoken to any Tory MPs today about this specifically, so I don't have any kind of on the day reactions. Yeah. But from the outside, I am as baffled as you are.
How do the other parties compare? Because obviously a lot of the focus is on the sort of Tory sex scandals, and they are more sort of prone to sex scandals. But I mean, is this a problem across the parties?
So a fun fact about me is that I really love walking on tightropes, wearing shoes covered in soap.
Is it an exclusively Tory problem, or might there be some wrong-uns elsewhere?
I don't believe it is. I don't know a lot about the Liberal Democrats, but on the Labour side, I have definitely heard some really, really horrible stories about Labour MPs. And I've also heard a fair few stories about kind of Labour insiders not treating victims in the way that victims should be treated, especially, because the perpetrator happened to also be a Labour person. So I'm not convinced. I would say that I think the Labour Party is better than the Conservative Party on this stuff, but that the bar is about an inch above the floor. Okay. So that's not saying a tremendous amount. So I think, I do think they're sincerely better, but by how much? Nah.
I also think there's something to be said about Westminster being quite a corrupting force. And there's loads of factors for why that is. The late night culture, the power dynamics built in, the bars, all these kind of things all kind of add to this. There is an issue with sexual misconduct and bullying amongst staff as well. It's not consistently just MPs. It really does feel like it's this culture that drip feeds through. So yes, MPs, but I think there is something kind of rotten about Westminster itself that just permeates.
And I will say, I could name some male political journalists as well who behave appallingly. Basically everyone who works around Westminster becomes a worse version of themselves as a result.
Lucy Powell said, issues of serious wrongdoing or harassment or bad culture in workplaces have been a constant cloud over this place, as we have said. The headlines bring the entire House into disrepute and add to the erosion of trust in Parliament and in politicians. All true, but the current crisis of trust, which you can say around Westminster, probably started with the expenses scandal in 2009, but it's mirrored across many institutions, across many countries. We're talking about conspiracy theories next. And that's one of the reasons why there are more conspiracy theories, because trust in basically everything except the sort of military and the police, which is a bit worrying, has plummeted. Do you think that is reversible? That just imagine the most integrity-packed version of a Starmer-led government, and you literally had, this won't happen, but you literally had year after year of just no scandals. I mean, do you think trust can be rebuilt, or is it just one-way traffic?
God, that is a big question, isn't it? I would like to think that trust can be rebuilt. There's definitely there's definitely a world in which you can probably stem the bleeding and not make it worse. Because I think, as you mentioned in the polling, a lot of people do seem to think that things have got actively worse since 2019, which actually I wouldn't disagree. So yes, but the problem is I think that the bar is so high in terms of you can probably, and as you said, have the perfect Starmer government where nothing ever goes wrong and every MP is entirely blameless, etc. But then if you just have one scandal a year and a half in, then all the people who want to believe that stuff will be like, well, there we go. That's what they've been hiding.
They're
so I
all
worry that, exactly. But all saying, oh, well, because I wonder as well if those stories stop coming out, then if the angle for the people who kind of want to believe in that stuff anyway will be like, oh, well, that's because the journalists are in on it, and that's, they're not reporting on it because they're all friends and they're all chums and they didn't care about the real people. So I think my problem is that, especially as long as the internet exists in its current form, is that a lot of people actually want to believe, I think, that Westminster is a swamp. Like, it's not just that they think it's a swamp and that really worries them and they wish it weren't. They're no, but that proves that, I'm right to hate everyone and every political party, etc. And I think once you get into that motivated reasoning, then I'm not really sure how you get people out of it.
We have discussed before what 3-word slogan we would suggest for Labour. And I actually think, not just on this issue, but across the issues, stem the bleeding would be a very good slogan. It doesn't promise too much. It doesn't promise too much.
Yeah, our Band-Aid Britain.
Yeah. Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question to the panel. This week's question comes from Sean Mack. He says, research from Channel 4 this week found that working class participation in TV and film is at a 10-year low. Only 8% of TV professionals were working class, but 60% were from middle or upper class backgrounds. TV is the mirror we hold up to our society, but I see no interest from any political party in levelling up acting, writing or directing. Should there be? Or do we have to resign ourselves to watching gritty urban TV shows where all the actors went to exclusive schools and have rich parents?
I mean, I do absolutely agree that it's a problem as someone like don't work in television myself, but I've got lots of friends who do, and I'm kind of adjacent to that world as a writer. And it is absolutely true that, things have clearly got worse, and also basically everyone's really middle class in all those, in all kind of like cultural sectors. It's one of those with the number of rooms I've been in where I've been like, God, I feel like a pauper, and that's probably a bad sign because I'm actually quite middle class myself.
Well, it's journalism obviously as well.
Yeah. But no, so I saw a point actually by Jack Rook, who I went to university with, who's wonderful, the guy who did Big Boys, and who is from a working class background himself, and he made the point on Twitter today actually saying that actually it's a cultural thing as well, where he's seen a lot of working class creatives being gossiped about as that really difficult or a nightmare and stuff. And like his point is saying, are they, or are they just fed up with working with poshos who don't put as much in and don't have as much to lose? Which I think is quite a good point as well. Of I think even if you do get those rare working class people in, they may not have the codes, or they may not be able to talk, in the way that you're meant to talk in, etc. And so we'll get kind of socially ostracized. And these are the sort of places where actually who matters a lot. So I do think there's this kind of vicious cycle at play at the moment in all creative industries, and I'm not really sure how we get out of it. And I think that the question raised a really good point of why aren't political parties doing more to level up the creative industries?
Well, the writer Terry White pointed out on Twitter that this is probably going to get worse, because what you're going to have is a lot of people who you would say from working class background, more of them have been growing up in actual poverty. So it's not just that they're going to like the wrong school and they don't have the contacts and they're not in that world, but literally they might have had parents who were just, struggling so hard that there was no question of even being able to sort of, take them to that sort of school drama class or whatever. And that because of greater inequality and growing food banks and so on, that you've got more people who have even less chance, and they're growing up now and they haven't even tried, we haven't seen that generation enter the industry yet. So is this something that kind of reveals something so, it's not just about TV and it's not just about journalism, that there is something so systemic about narrowing opportunities and narrowing social mobility, and this is just perhaps visible because you can see them on screen?
Yeah, I think so, and I think absolutely there is a report out by the Trussell Trust today when we recorded, just about the level of poverty and the sort of handouts from food banks. I mean, it really is just, I don't think we've really got our heads around how bad it's getting in this country and how many children are being plunged into poverty. The other thing is that we have a government that really doesn't care about the arts, is really focused on productivity and what can be sort of economically productive for this country, that, you know, they'd much rather people go into jobs that sort of, you know, coding and maths and things that you can obviously see an outcome that would make more money for the country. And that kind of leaves the arts as like a hobby horse for people with loads of money and who can be funded by their parents. And I think Marie makes a really good point that even when you are middle class, which I am as well, you don't realise like the level of wealth some people
There's
have.
so much more going on above us.
And, how you know, people in London who are completely funded by their parents and don't have to work and they can do things like that. And the arts shouldn't be like that. And you're right, it absolutely changes the sort of art we consume. And it is so weird to see, as this person pointed out, gritty urban TV shows when you know all the actors. Not only did they go to really expensive schools, but their parents are probably very, very well connected. In fact, I've noticed recently, whenever you sort of look at a lot of these big kind of shows on Broadway or in the West End, they're casting actors who are already really well known to draw the crowds. And you just think, if you were trying to break into the arts and you don't have a famous parent and you don't have many credits, it must just be impossible.
Oh, but in the same way as well, that now the BBC only ever does podcasts with massively like famous celebrities who don't have any experience in podcasting. And
If I
it's
have
a bit
to
like, well,
see-
you know, fuck us then, right?
If I have to see Sam Thompson or Zara McDermott do one more thing. I mean, Zara McDermott's documentaries, I actually wrote a piece about this for the New Statesman. She's not a journalist. Why is she creating documentaries about these really important subjects?
Well, this is the thing about, like, you know, the whole Nepo baby discussion is that actually if you name individuals, a lot of the individuals, people don't have a problem with, you know, Dakota Johnson or whoever. Or like Anya Taylor-Joy, parents not famous but wealthy. It's not the individuals. A lot of the time you're just like, oh, you're really good. But it's weird that when you look at older actors and you've got your Timothy Spalls or Brian Cox, who come from completely different backgrounds and are much more reminiscent of the kind of social mobility you had with that wave of the people who came through in the 60s. And it's that. It's not so much, it's not resentment towards the individials.
And in some
unless
cases.
it's Lawrence Fox. But yeah, some cases. But it's more just like, well, what, you know, why is more effort not being made? But I worry that it's actually revealing a much greater crisis of social mobility, and that people are not being exposed to the arts in that way. It is also they're not being exposed to enough food and other opportunities.
Yeah.
Next up, Health Minister Maria Caulfield has wandered into conspiracy land by promoting weird delusions about 15-minute cities. She has been told to refer herself to the Ethics Committee, which I'm sure she will do. Transport Secretary Mark Harper got into trouble for the same reason back in October. Why are actual cabinet ministers amplifying conspiracy theories from the far-right fringes? And what are 15-minute cities in reality? Marie, just briefly, what did Maria Caulfield claim? Like, where did she make these claims?
Oh, so she put out a leaflet locally that said that the Lib Dems and the Greens in the area wanted to, I quote, introduce a road toll system called 15-Minute City, where you will have to pay a congestion charge if you travel by car more than 15 minutes from your home.
That's not real, is it?
It's just, I genuinely, when I read the story, I had to reread it to be like, did I pass that wrong somehow?
So we discussed 15-minute cities as an idea years ago, but that was before the cranks got on the case, and we were just like, what is this interesting concept? Can you briefly explain it, especially as I believe it started in Gay Paris?
Well, my greatest foe. How dare you? Yes, no, actually, that one of Anne Hidalgo's advisors, I believe, really started coming up with it. Although I think that there were conversations in Spain as well, so it's kind of a slightly pan-European thing. But it's a very straightforward idea of, like, you know, kind of urban planning theory of saying that most daily necessities and services, so like work, shopping, education, healthcare, and leisure, should be reached by a 15-minute walk, bike ride, or public transport ride from any point in a city, which seems reasonable to me, and if anything, just like quite boring. That's not even a kind of like revolutionary, massive change to the way people live.
Well, the guy that's most associated with it, Carlos Marinho of the Sorbonne, who has been getting death threats from the Crazies, and he's just he's sort of just like shrugging them off and goes, "I'm clearly not up. I'm just a boring academic."
I just wanted to buy my baguette.
He's totally transparent about it. It's just like there is literally nothing sinister about this. So is the paranoid version, like, where does the paranoid version come from?
So the paranoid version goes something along the lines of Western governments are trying to oppress their populations, would fine residents for leaving their home districts, quote unquote, or they would actually confine people in, I quote, open-air prisons altogether. So that's apparently, so the world governments, also the World Economic Forum, as always, so the WEF is somehow behind it.
Always.
I think Tory MP Nick Fletcher called it an international socialist concept, which I quite enjoyed.
Because as we all know, the
WEF
and the IMF are run by socialists. Yes.
But yes, I think the idea is saying, oh, well, you're going to have your 15-minute bubble. Like every citizen will have that, but then you will not be able to leave it. So I think that's the thing, which again, I have no idea where they got that from.
It's very sci-fi.
It is. But yeah, now I don't quite understand where I struggled to actually find where that came from originally, where that kind of metastasized.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of that bit in the Simpsons movie where they put the big dome I just always think of that.
Springfield into a 15-minute city.
Which I think it sounds fine.
So I believe that it sort of it came out of like the pandemic supercharged conspiracy theories, and so people didn't like lockdown. And then there are obviously the people that talk about plandemic and all that nonsense. But then there were people that started talking about climate lockdown, which was the idea that in order to fight climate change, which doesn't exist, then there would have to be new kinds of lockdown, and you'd have to sort of stay in your home. And it all got wrapped up like that. So Mark Harper, I went back to his quote, and it's quite remarkable because he actually does the real thing, which he likes, but then he disapproves of the thing that doesn't exist. So he goes, I am calling time on the misuse of so-called 15-minute cities. There's nothing wrong with making sure people can walk or cycle to the shops or school. That's traditional town planning. Okay, because that's sort of what it is. What is different, what is sinister, and what we shouldn't tolerate is the idea that local councils can decide how often you go to the shops, and they ration who uses the roads and when, and they police it all with CCTV.
I agree with him.
That would be bad.
How can you object to that? It's pretty reasonable.
I've never seen someone just going like that. Just, I kind of like, I approve of taxing people a certain amount of their income to pay for public services. But what I don't approve of is taxing 100% and then beating them to death.
Now, I think you really get that quite a lot in feminism. You'll get lots of men or like some quite reactionary women being like, yeah, obviously I think men and women should be equal, but I don't think all men should be murdered. And you're like, so we're in agreement. It's just, yeah.
So, Zoe, I was thinking about the way that Susan Hall wholly invented a plan by Sadiq Khan to charge drivers by the mile. And so then I just thought, is a lot of this paranoia coming from motorists? So sort of, they don't like ULEZ, they don't like low traffic neighbourhoods, but in some way they're not sinister enough. That might just seem that they're just grumbling. And so they've invented another thing, because it does seem to be like we cannot, it's not so much people saying, oh, you won't let us walk to the shops. It's just saying we won't let us drive out of our districts or sectors or whatever sci-fi term they want to use.
Yeah, and we know that there are lots of motorists in this country, and they get very, very cross about fuel prices and very, very cross about, having restrictions on their car. And I do think part of the reason that is because public transport in this country is so bad. So people are very reliant on their cars. But I think also there's this obvious tension between green measures and people and using your car, because if everybody was using their car, that wouldn't help with us trying to get to our kind of net zero ambitions. So I think people have noticed that they are going to have to stop using their cars, but it doesn't seem to be getting easier for them to stop using their cars, and therefore it feels unfair. And when it feels unfair, it can start feeling conspiratorial. Why is no one thinking about my interests? Why is no one, why is no one thinking about how this affects me? It doesn't seem fair that I have to stop doing something just because you want to do something, and I can't see that much evidence of climate change in this country anyway. And I think those are kind of the sort of ideas that percolate in people's heads. And we've seen, Susan Hall really tried to take advantage of that, because in London there is this kind of war over the roads and cars and how much people should be driving. I was wondering, is part of this kind of war on motorists, are there lots of people in this country who use cars because they don't have any other form of transport, and are they of lower incomes? And it's actually not the case. Actually, people with lower incomes are far less likely to use cars. So it's not like it's this kind of cost of living push, war on workers as well that Rishi Sunak's been talking about. It's actually just, I think, really a lot of the discontent comes from the fact that if you live in an area where you're dependent on your car, it's probably because the public transport there is so terrible.
And I think we're in a culture, unfortunately, now where if there's something you just don't like, you turn it into a conspiracy theory, as opposed to it just being a policy you don't like, which is fine. There's lots of those. Can I just talk about the politics? So Reform UK seems to have a wonderful palette of conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, climate deniers, chemtrails believers, and so on. But an increasing number of Tories, including the cabinet, are taking these conspiracy theories. Most people have never heard of them unless they watch certain shows on GB News. Voters traditionally don't like people who seem crazy. Is there any electoral benefit to this? Is this just like Maria Caulfield is not the Prime Minister, probably will never be. So is she just like blurting out some half-baked idea? Is there any sense that the Tories are actually going, what we need to do is find more conspiracy theories?
I think, you kind of have your answer. They are desperate for these lost voters to Reform UK. And a lot of these voters are this slightly older voter group who I think spend a lot of time online on Facebook, where we know these conspiracy theories move around and they're sent back and forth. And I also think GB News and Talk TV both needed to have their content go viral quite a lot. So having these kind of extraordinary stories and these conspiracies made great clips. Those clips then circulate on Facebook. They're picked up by the same people. And I think the Tories have just tapped into the fact that there is this big chunk of voters who are being lost, but who seem to enjoy this stuff and enjoy talking about it. And so I think it's kind of trying to talk their language a little bit to see if they'll come back.
I just got I've got some Conservatives in the family, and their reaction to this is just like, would just be so revolted and confused. Like, what are you talking about? It just seems like if you're chasing the GB News lot, you're probably losing like normal people. Marie, I am old enough to remember when conspiracy theories tended to focus on things like the CIA or Mossad. You really did get up to some stuff. And now they seem to take these quite woolly technocratic ideas like Agenda 21 and the Great Reset, and now 15-Minute Cities, the most benign of them all, and then trying to demonize Bill Gates, of all people. Why does this compulsion to, instead of looking at people and organizations who do seem quite shady, to just take the sort of blandest plans and then go, well, actually, it's about depopulation?
So I wonder, this is a theory rather than anything else, but I wonder if the difference is that pre-internet you would by nature focus on something that was more national. So the CIA, that was probably like mostly kind of, people in the US or people in Western Europe going, oh, well, that's going on in the US, or Mossad, etc. Whereas I think that in a kind of internet era, anything that looks like it's trying to change the world, quote unquote, kind of like global level thing is a lot more likely to go really viral, because you'll have nutters in the US, nutters in Europe, nutters in Africa, nutters everywhere agreeing that the West is actually trying to control everyone. Like, my theory would be that of like, as the world has gone global, then conspiracy theories by nature have gone global. But the problem is, again, as you pointed out, a lot of the companies kind of doing work on a global scale are quite boring. So they just end up having to latch onto stuff that's just quite bland.
If you read The Great Reset, it's not only is it not scary, it's not very exciting. It's very much just like, wouldn't it be good if things were better? It's true. Penny Mordaunt and Lucy Powell, them again, have just launched a guide warning MPs about conspiracy theories that they might echo without realising it. Phrases like the Great Reset, the Great Replacement, climate lockdown, and so on. This presumes that they are merely naive and ignorant and not really sure the sort of the dark forces they're tapping into. Do you? I could sort of believe that of Maria Caulfield, but maybe not that backbencher that bound on about socialism. Like, is how many of these people do you think are true believers, and how many are just sort of like just don't really understand?
So I will go back to a quote by a senior political academic who I will not name because I think he regretted having said that to a journalist on the record, who I once interviewed about Westminster stuff. And he said, he was like, you'd kind of imagine, and he was like, intellectually, I know that there's probably a normal spread of intelligence in Westminster where you'll have, people all along that kind of scale. But he's like, but then again, in practice, the more time I spend in politics and I talk to MPs and things, I think that there's basically a lot of them who are genuinely incredibly clever and really sharp, and then not a lot in the middle, and then quite a lot where you look at them and you're like, and you tie your own shoelaces in the morning, do you? And I think it is partly that. I think a lot of them don't seem to be, incredibly sharp. I think part of it, I can remember someone else made that point, which I thought was really good, of saying that actually MPs are probably part of like the kind of people who are most at risk of those kind of conspiracy theories. They spend a lot of time by themselves. They have a lot of time on their hands of kind of waiting around due to the weird nature of their job and traveling a lot, etc. So they're just going to be scrolling on their phone a lot. There are also people who tend to have a high opinion of themselves and their own opinions, etc. So actually, members of parliament have the perfect profile for people to fall for conspiracy theories. Which, again, I can't remember who it was, but I think that was a good point. So I think it's a lot of that. And also, sure, a bunch of it will also just be cynical, kind of like, well, if we can stick it to the lefties, then maybe, then any weapon is kind of acceptable.
Because it's interesting that Mark Harper kind of apologised and hasn't done anything like that since. And I wondered if he genuinely was just like...
pushed it too far.
Hadn't thought it through. I don't know. So Andrew Bridgen had to go quite a long way in the anti-vax direction to be suspended. Should there be tougher sanctions? Do from the whips? Do the parties sort of need to wake up? Well, one party in particular, although there's obviously the left-wing conspiracy theories as well. They just have to sort of wake up to this stuff and like notice earlier when somebody is using these kind of red flag phrases and references.
I think so. I mean, you would hope in any kind of workplace, if somebody seemed to be saying things that sounded slightly more radical than, if someone seemed to be being radicalized, you would hope that somebody would notice it and say something. I mean, the Andrew Bridgen thing is interesting because, I mean, we don't really know the ins and outs of it, but his wife had been posting quite a lot on Twitter and had sort of slightly suggested that he had maybe been radicalized. He had no longer was sort of interacting with his wife and child. And it was this sort of all quite extraordinary story, which in a way made you feel almost slightly sorry for him. So you'd think that the party, because it cares about the MPs in it, should be keeping an eye on these things. The only other thing is, obviously, when you do then remove someone from the party or sanction them, that gives weight to people who support that theory to say, there you go. He said too much. It's a broad church, but apparently he was too much for you. You've silenced him, you've kicked him out. And, that can also be the worry about removing someone from the party too early.
Well, I suppose my hope is always that you can kind of, nip radicalization in the bud, because I think you see this a lot online, is that we're very used to sort of young men, but there's so many middle-aged people, and you can see them on social media all the time, visibly getting radicalized. And then they get to the point where it's just like there is no way back. And so I'm wondering, not necessarily like suspend them as soon as they start saying stuff, but maybe this is what happened with, Mark Harper. Someone went, look, mate, you shouldn't be saying this stuff. And then he just stopped. So maybe they are doing it behind the scenes. Finally, I just wondered, Oxford Council has stopped using the phrase 15-minute cities. There's been a lot of controversy there about various like traffic restrictions and so on. Do you worry that these conspiracy theories, even though they have nothing to do with the reality, might actually kill a very good idea? Or will it just force a little bit of a rebranding, that people will try and create sort of communities where everything's much closer together, but they just won't call it that?
I think a lot of people do talk about these things without really knowing what they mean. They can be grouped in with other things and they can kind of become like a whistle for something else. It just becomes 15-minute cities becomes another way of saying the state's trying to control everything I do. So in that way, rebranding it can be quite useful because it can take out the actually this has just become a terrible phrase to wouldn't it be great if all your shops and all your amenities are in 15 minutes walk of you, and then everyone goes, oh yeah, that sounds actually really convenient for me, but the problem is then it will inevitably get a new name or a new slogan and the same people will latch onto it. So it's hard to really tell what would change that?
Well, that's why the WEF rejected my plan to rename the Great Reset Hooray for Fun Times. Because they said they'll just turn that into a conspiracy theory as well. We've reached the end of the show. So what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Marie?
Oh, I have got an absolutely insane story from France this week, which actually happened. I think that took place last month, but the British press has not seen it yet. So,
Okay.
So Marine Le Pen has these 3 nieces who are all like really pretty and young and blonde, and they ended up appearing on TikTok. And it was, this kind of mix of like, quite sultry sort of like poses and clearly like tit heavy videos and stuff, while obviously talking about kind of like far right talking points, because because of their aunt. And they went really viral. I think some posts got, was it, I think, nearly 500,000 likes, etc. So went really viral on French TikTok. Just one super quick problem. Marine Le Pen does not have 3 hot nieces.
What?
Yeah. No. So these were deep fake, like AI boosted deep fakes. So these women do not exist.
What?
The parties have denied that they had anything to do with it, like all the far right parties. So we have no idea who's behind them. So it is just this, completely mad story where, just fake fascist hot woman related to Marine Le Pen just kept going really viral on French internet.
Well, I suppose if you think the people who make deep fakes, what are they into generally? Hot women and far right politics. So why not put them together?
It is also such a weird thing. So the way they did it is by taking videos of like porn stars and then just adding the face of either Marine Le Pen or Marion Maréchal, the other main woman in the family, on that. And actually, I've watched some of them for work, Your Honour. And it is actually reasonably seamless. So yeah. Wow. So that is my insane that, oh God, what's coming for us story of the week.
Wow, that's fou.
Wow, look at you.
Just making an effort. Zoe?
This story definitely didn't go under the radar, but I think an element of it did. So we knew earlier in the week there was this report released about the crisis in maternity care wards, the sort of level of just terrible care across the country, that the maternity sector is about 2,500 midwives short. It's just the whole system is in crisis, and there are many, many women who are dealing with pain and trauma as a result of these traumatic births. But one bit that I don't think really was spoken about enough, and I found this extraordinary, and this came out slightly before the report last week, is that the NHS spent 1.1 billion on maternity negligence payments last year. To put this in context, the budget for maternity services in England is 3 billion. So that's a third of its budget spent on maternity negligence payments.
That's insane.
That is insane. And maybe it was talked about a little bit. I didn't spot it in the coverage of the report, and I think that is extraordinary. That was a Sky News bit of analysis there. And it just really shows you just how absolutely terrible and how much those services are in freefall.
Well, mine's also not, it's maybe under some people's radar, but not under the radar. What's been going on in Georgia, where the Prime Minister, despite technically wanting to be, join the EU, has introduced a Kremlin-inspired law against so-called foreign agents, which means any organizations that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad. This is very popular with Putin or Orban, that crew. This spawned gigantic anti-Russia and pro-EU protests, mostly young people. Police waded in with tear gas, rubber bullets and truncheons. And there's these remarkable pictures of the protesters wrapped in the EU flag, and what the EU means to them is so powerful, and it's such a liberating force. And as it's a bit of a Romaniac. I find it very sort of inspiring, because sometimes the reality of the EU can be very, it can be like hard work. It's disappointing, and I wish they'd done more on that. And oh gosh, they're not really sort of selling themselves as this idealistic project. And yet there you see literally people standing in front of rows of riot police wrapped in the blue and yellow. And quite a lot of prominent figures came out against the law as well. The leader of the opposition said, "If my beating prevented that of another young activist, I'm only happy it happened to me. This country belongs to the passionate next generation whom I follow till the end."
Oh, wow.
And that was something a politician said that I found genuinely moving. So the law did pass, but let's see what happens in Georgia from now on. That's the show. Thank you to Zoe.
Thank you.
Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
Don't go. It's the extra bit soon, just after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a thank you to the generous Patreon supporters who keep us in the podcast game. Why not join them for as little as £3 a month to get the podcast early, without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We will see you next time.
Hello, and thanks for contributing to the health of the podcast to Eleanor Heisel, James Phillips, Nanashi Matami, and Harriet Strehan.
A big shout from me and many thanks to new supporters Gordon Chapman-Fox, John, Jay Dickman and Jonathan Adlam.
And finally, welcome aboard from me to Craig Kidd, Richard Davison, Chris Watts and Kieron Clear.